My daughter did not let the blanket touch the crib. That was the part I remembered first. Not her words, not the room, not even the way my hands started shaking after she placed it back into them. It was the space she protected, the careful gap between the wool and the white rail. Like what I had made over 6 months with my own hands was not a gift. It was a risk. She took one look at it, smiled with her mouth, not her eyes, then lifted both hands toward me and said, "Mom, I can't have this in here." Not thank you first. Not let me see it. Not even, oh, you made it. Just, I can't have this in here. And because the room was so clean, so quiet, so aggressively calm, the sentence landed harder than if she had said it in anger. My name is Mara Ellison. I was 61 years old that spring. My daughter Phoebe was 34 and 8 months pregnant with her first child. The nursery reveal had been her idea. That mattered. She had invited me, not in the vague family way where someone says, "You should stop by sometime." No, she had texted 3 weeks in advance, Saturday at 2. "I want you to see the nursery before the baby gets here." Then a second message. "No extra guests, just immediate family. Keep it low stimulation, please." That was already her language by then. Low stimulation, sensory safe, certified materials only. No synthetic fragrance, no unverified textiles. No visual clutter. No old family items unless previously approved. There was a manifesto quality to her pregnancy. Not emotional. Procedural. Everything had a list. Everything had a rule. Everything had a rationale ready in case anyone older than 35 tried to call it fear. The thing is, I understood part of it. The world she was having this child in was not the world I had raised her in. Information moved faster. Risks became searchable. Every fear arrived with a thread, a forum, a study summary, 3 contradictory expert opinions, and 1 influencer mother making oat flour in a glass kitchen while explaining why cotton sleep sacks were quietly ruining infant nervous systems. By the time Phoebe was 7 months along, she wasn't preparing for a baby. She was curating an environment. There's a difference. Preparation leaves room for life. Curating tries to control what life will feel like before it gets there. The blanket had been my answer to that. Not because I wanted to fight her rules, because I wanted to bring something human into a room that felt more audited than loved. I started knitting it the week after she announced the pregnancy. Not immediately after the phone call. Later that night. That matters too, because the first thing I did after I found out I was going to be a grandmother was not cry or call anyone or post anything or start shopping. I opened the cedar chest at the foot of my bed, took out the old pattern book my mother had kept folded in wax paper for decades, then ignored every pattern inside it and designed something of my own. That was deliberate. I wanted no lace edge, no old-fashioned scallops, no pastel nonsense that made a child look like an accessory to nostalgia. Phoebe hated nostalgia when it arrived in visible forms. She tolerated family history only when it came in neat sentences and did not require dusting. So I made it simple. Soft cream. No added dyes. Organic merino, the expensive kind from a farm in Vermont that could trace every lot back to specific flocks and pasture conditions. I paid more for the yarn than I had paid for my winter coat 2 years earlier. I told myself that made sense because babies have more future in front of them than coats. The pattern was clean, modern, wide basket weave at the center, narrow-ribbed border that wouldn't snag little fingers, dense enough for warmth, breathable enough for a stroller, washable if handled correctly, which I knew it would be if it came from me, and suspected it might not be if it came from anyone else. I knitted at night. That was the ritual. 9:30 to 11, usually. Tea cooling beside me. Lamp on. Television off. Just the sound of wool moving through fingers that had done this long enough to know when tension was wrong by feel alone. Every row felt like a small argument against disposability. Not because stores didn't sell blankets. They sold hundreds. Hypoallergenic, temperature-regulating, machine-certified, aesthetic-approved blankets folded into perfect squares on websites that photographed motherhood like a Scandinavian design philosophy. But those things had no time in them. No person. No evidence that someone had sat still for months and thought of your child before the child had a face. That was what I was making, not a textile. Time converted into warmth. I never told Phoebe about it while I was working. That was my first mistake. Or maybe not mistake. Maybe hope. which is sometimes worse because it arrives wearing innocence and still gets you hurt. I wanted the blanket to appear finished, complete, thought through. I wanted her to hold it and feel, not obligation, not guilt, not some old world pressure to honor the handmade, but recognition. I wanted her to understand that I had taken her rules seriously enough to build something inside them. So, yes, I read the baby registry. All of it. I read the shared spreadsheet too, though she never meant for me to see that and only sent it by accident in a family text when she was trying to forward the gift list to her husband, Devin. The spreadsheet had tabs. Nursery approved items, feeding approved items, postpartum approved items, not for use, ask before purchase, temporary guest use only, hard no. Under textiles, she had written, no weighted blankets, no synthetic fills, no dyes with unknown source chemistry, no inherited linens, no handmade items unless pre-cleared for fiber content and wash process. That line stayed with me. Not because it offended me, because it challenged me. India. There is a certain kind of mother-daughter relationship where the daughter spends her 30s trying to prove that boundaries are not punishments, and the mother spends her 60s trying to prove that love is not intrusion. Phoebe and I had lived inside that tension for 12 years, ever since she moved out, ever since she discovered therapy language and began using it with the clean certainty of someone who had found better tools than the ones she was raised with and intended never to be caught without them again. I don't say that mockingly. Some of it helped her. Some of it improved us. A lot of it became a shield she held up whenever ordinary family friction threatened to become mutual, rather than one-directional. I learned, eventually. I stopped dropping by unannounced. I stopped giving advice she hadn't asked for. I stopped saying things like, when you have children, in the casual tone mothers use when they want to sound supportive while still laying down a road. I adapted. Not perfectly, but sincerely. That's why the blanket mattered. It was proof that I had listened. I checked fiber source. I kept the labels. I wrote down the wash instructions. I even made a card listing the exact materials, the supplier, and the water temperature I had used for the pre-blocking rinse so she wouldn't have to wonder whether handmade meant unregulated. I thought that would matter to her. I thought effort translated. That was my second mistake. By the time Saturday arrived, I had finished the blanket 2 days earlier and folded it into tissue paper, without ribbon, because ribbon looked decorative, and decorative looked like I had made it for a photograph instead of a baby. I drove across town with it on the seat beside me. One hand on the wheel, one hand tapping the tissue package every few minutes at red lights just to reassure myself it was still there. Still neat, still as good as I had believed it was under the lamp at 11:30 the night before. The neighborhood where Phoebe and Devin had bought their place was the kind of new development that pretended to be rooted. Narrow trees already planted at measured intervals. Sidewalks poured too clean. Porch columns with decorative brackets designed to imply craft while concealing mass production. The houses all had variations of the same voice. Tasteful, expensive, not yet lived into. Their place was painted pale gray with black trim. No toys in the yard yet. No stroller visible. No evidence that a child would soon arrive except the one car seat base I later noticed through the back window of Devin's SUV. Phoebe opened the door before I rang. That should have felt welcoming. Instead, it felt monitored. She looked beautiful in the strange, severe way pregnancy had made her. Her face was fuller, but sharper somehow. Hair pulled back. No jewelry except her wedding band. Cream knit dress. Bare feet because she no longer wore shoes in the house unless transitioning to an outside environment. She hugged me carefully. Not cold. Measured. Baby first. I understood that. Then her eyes dropped to the package in my hands. Not suspicious, just immediately alert. "What's that?" she asked. There it was. The room had not even entered the story yet, and already the object had. "A gift," I said. Her mouth moved slightly, not a smile, a calculation. "You didn't need to bring anything." I could have lied then. Said it was just something small. Said it was for later. Said it was for me, not for the nursery specifically. Instead, I made the next mistake. I made something. Not bought, not found. Made. The word changed her body before she said anything. One shoulder tightened. Not much. Enough. That should have warned me. Inside, the house smelled like unscented detergent and new paint. Not a trace of cooking. Not a trace of life, really. Just clean surfaces and filtered air and the faint medicinal sweetness of the diffuser she kept in the hallway, with whatever pregnancy-safe oil blend she currently trusted. Devin came out from the dining room and kissed my cheek. He was one of those men who had built his adult personality from trying not to resemble his father and had overcorrected into politeness so consistent it sometimes looked like moral absence. "Mara," he said. "Good to see you." Always kind. Never early to conflict. That would matter later. Phoebe led me down the hall toward the nursery with the kind of careful pace people adopt when they are trying to keep a moment gentle before it has the chance to become complicated. The door was already open. I saw the room before I entered it and understood immediately why the blanket had no chance. It wasn't a nursery. Not really. It was a thesis. Every surface had been stripped of excess and then arranged according to a logic so strict that even comfort seemed to require permission. White crib, ashwood rocking chair, one long shelf with 5 books facing outward as if the baby had already developed a taste for restrained color palettes. No stuffed animals, no mobiles, no family photographs, no softness that had not first passed through aesthetic and compliance filters. The walls were painted a color I'm sure had a name on some designer card but looked to me like expensive oatmeal. The rug was hand-woven and flat enough to communicate that no one intended to spill joy there without first checking whether joy matched the room. And in the center, over the crib, hung a framed manifesto in clean black type. Not literally called that. It said, "This room is built for calm, safety, sleep, and regulation. Everything that enters it should serve one of those purposes." I stopped walking, not outwardly, inside, because I understood then that the nursery reveal had not been a tour. It was an orientation, rules disguised as decor. Phoebe was watching me. That mattered more than the room. She wanted my reaction. Not because she was cruel, because she needed to see whether I would understand that this was her territory in a way motherhood was making newly absolute. "It's beautiful," I said. That part was true. Beauty can exist inside coldness. People confuse those things all the time. She relaxed slightly. Good. I should have left the blanket in the tissue paper and brought it out later at my own house or after the baby came or never. Instead, I moved toward the rocking chair and said, "I made this for her." Her. We knew it was a girl. That had felt like the one uncomplicated thing in months. A daughter coming to my daughter. Some clean line of women continuing, despite everything modern motherhood and modern daughters had done to complicate what used to be assumed. I unfolded the blanket, slowly, cream wool opening into light. The basket weave caught the window and deepened in the center just the way I had hoped it would. For one impossible second, I felt proud. Not defensive, not sentimental, just proud of the thing itself. It looked beautiful in my hands. More beautiful than it had draped over the back of my chair while I checked the edges one last time on Thursday night. Devin said, quietly, "Wow." Good man, wrong timing. Phoebe didn't step closer. That was when I knew. Not because she looked angry, because she didn't move toward it at all. Movement tells the truth before language gets there. She took a breath, then another. Her eyes moved over the blanket the way people examine food labels after an allergic reaction. Not delight. Assessment. I heard my own voice trying, stupidly, to save the moment. "It's organic merino." I kept all the tags. I washed it without fragrance, and I wrote down... She put her hands out then. Not to receive it. To stop it. Palms toward me. A gesture so small and so complete that I felt my grip on the wool change before I understood why. "Mom," she said softly, "I can't have this in here." There it was. The sentence, the gap between blanket and crib, the room going cool around us without changing temperature at all. And then, before I could decide whether I had misheard or whether explanation could still rescue dignity, she took the folded blanket from my hands only long enough to place it back against my chest. She did not let it touch the crib. She did not let it touch the chair. She did not let it touch anything in the room. As if love, once made by hand, had become contamination unless approved first. I stood there holding 6 months of evening labor, while my daughter looked at me the way people look at parcels that arrive without being ordered. "I sent the textile list," she said. Not cruel, not apologetic, clinical. That was almost worse. Because if she had sounded angry, I could have met anger. If she had sounded guilty, I could have forgiven something. But clinical rejection leaves nowhere warm to stand. I know, I said. And because humiliation has terrible timing, I heard my own voice trying to stay normal in a room that had already withdrawn every ordinary path. I followed it. She shook her head once. Not much. Not enough. Those 2 words hit harder than if she had said she hated it, because she didn't reject the blanket as ugly. She rejected my competence, my effort, my ability to understand the rules she had set for access. I looked at Devin. He looked back at me with the expression of a man who knew what was happening was bad and had no intention of stepping between his wife and the logic she had built around motherhood. That too mattered. Not because he was cruel, because he was aligned. And alignment beats kindness every time in domestic power. What exactly is wrong with it? I asked. That was my mistake. The first one in that room. Because asking for criteria accepts the frame. Now the conversation was not about the rejection. It was about whether I had submitted an item correctly. Phoebe answered immediately. Handmade wool can't be verified for consistency at the same level as certified nursery textiles. I blinked once. Not because I didn't understand the words, because I understood them too well. This was not emotion speaking, it was policy. She pointed, not at the blanket itself, but at the card tucked into the tissue paper. You listed the fiber source, which I appreciate. But I don't know if every handling stage stayed contaminant-free. I don't know if the stitch density creates overheating pockets. I don't know if hand-finished edges can unravel in a way that becomes hazardous. Devin winced slightly at that last word. Hazardous? There it was, not old-fashioned, not unnecessary, dangerous. I looked down at the blanket. My hands had started trembling by then, very slightly, enough that the wool moved where it draped over my wrists. 6 months of work, transformed in under 30 seconds from heirloom to risk profile. And because the room was so quiet, I could hear the rocking chair wood settle near the window like it too had been waiting to see which way this would go. Phoebe saw my face and softened her tone by maybe 5%. This isn't personal, she said. That line. That cursed modern line. As if intimacy can be stripped out of rejection simply by declaring the rejection procedural. I almost laughed then. Not because anything was funny. Because some pain becomes ridiculous the moment it gets translated into wellness language. Not personal. A grandmother makes a blanket for your child with her own hands. You hand it back before it touches the crib. Then you say it's not personal. No, it was nothing else. I should have left then. That would have been clean. Instead, I stayed 1 minute too long, which is what people do when they still hope dignity can be negotiated out of a room that has already made its decision. That extra minute would cost me. And that is where the real story begins. I should have left with the blanket still warm in my hands. Instead, I asked one more question. What do you want me to do with it? Not emotional, not accusatory, practical. That was the mistake. Because practical questions invite policy answers. Phoebe didn't hesitate. You can keep it, she said. Keep it, not use it later, not we'll revisit. Not even maybe for when she's older, just remove it from the system. File it under not approved. I nodded once, small. Controlled. Because if you let the reaction out too early, the rest of the room gets to rewrite it. I made it for her, I said. I know. You're not going to use it. No. Clear, clean, finished. That should have been the end. But something in the way she stood there, calm, certain, already moving on, told me this wasn't about wool. It was about access. And access always has rules. You could have told me before I made it, I said. I did, she replied. That made me look up. I sent the list. That's not the same thing. It is to me. There it was again. Not miscommunication, definition. To her, a document was a boundary. To me, a conversation was. We had never reconciled that difference. Now it was costing me something tangible. I folded the blanket back into the tissue. Carefully. Not because she cared, because I did. The act of folding gave my hands something to do while the rest of me caught up. Devin cleared his throat. Soft. Measured. Mara, it's not that she doesn't appreciate it. I looked at him, not angry, just waiting. He continued, we just have a system we're trying to follow. System. Good word. Neutral, safe, removes emotion, removes responsibility, places everything under structure. What happens if something doesn't fit the system? I asked. Phoebe answered before he could. It doesn't come in. That was the first real boundary. Not implied, not softened, defined. Does that apply to people too? I asked. Silence, short but sharp, because now we were no longer talking about the blanket. Phoebe's eyes changed slightly. Not defensive. Alert. That's not fair, she said. Answer the question. Mara, Devin said, warning now. I didn't look at him, because this wasn't his system. He was just aligned with it. Phoebe crossed her arms. Not tightly, just enough. We're creating a stable environment, she said. I understand that. Then why are you pushing? Because I want to know where I stand. That was the real question. Not about wool, not about compliance, about position. Phoebe exhaled, slow, measured. Then she said it. If you want to be part of her life, you need to follow the rules. There it was. Not emotional, not reactive. Structural, conditional. I nodded once, because clarity, even when it hurts, is cleaner than guessing. What rules? I asked. She didn't hand me a list. She already had it. In her head. Ready. No unapproved items. I understand. No unscheduled visits. I understand. No undermining decisions. I paused. Define undermining. Questioning in front of her. Introducing alternatives. Creating confusion. She's a newborn. She will grow. Yes, she would. Inside a system. And if I don't follow them? I asked. That was the question. The one everything had been building toward. Phoebe didn't hesitate. Then we limit access. There it was. Clean, unambiguous, no drama, no threat, just policy. Limit access to my granddaughter, to my own blood, to the child I had already imagined holding in that rocking chair, not as punishment, as structure. Something in me settled then. Not broke, not exploded, settled, because uncertainty had been replaced, not with comfort, with truth. This wasn't rejection of a blanket. It was negotiation of presence. And I had been negotiating without knowing it. I hadn't made the blanket for the baby. Not really. I had made it for access, for belonging, for a place in a room that had already been defined before I entered it. That was my error. Not the wool, not the pattern, the assumption. I see, I said. Phoebe relaxed slightly, because she thought I was accepting. I wasn't. I was recalibrating. Are these your rules? I asked. Or his? I nodded toward Devin. That landed, because now alignment had to be named. Phoebe didn't look at him. They're ours. Did he write them? No. Did you? Yes. That mattered, because now I knew where the system originated. Devin spoke then. Careful. I support her, he said. Of course he did. That was his role, not architect, reinforcement. You're making this bigger than it is, Phoebe said. That line. That exact line. I had heard it before. Years ago. Different context. Same tone. That's when something connected. Not fully. Not yet. But enough to create a question. Where did you learn to think like this? I asked. She frowned. What do you mean? This level of control. It's called being prepared. No, I said. It's something else. She didn't answer, because the question wasn't about parenting anymore. It was about origin. I picked up the blanket, held it once more, then looked at the crib. White, untouched, perfect, empty, and understood something simple. That crib didn't need my blanket. It needed compliance. Now everything was clear. The blanket was rejected. The rules were real. Access was conditional. but something deeper had just surfaced. Phoebe didn't invent this system. She inherited it. I had heard that sentence before. You're making this bigger than it is. Not in this house, not in this room, not in this version of my daughter. Years ago, different content, same tone. That's why it didn't sit right. Because it wasn't new. It was learned. I stood there holding the blanket, looking at the crib, and the memory came back without asking permission. Phoebe at 16, standing in our kitchen, arms crossed the same way, voice controlled the same way, telling me, "You're making this bigger than it is." Back then, it had been about a different boundary. Not a nursery, not a baby. A locked door. She had been 16, I had been 45. Her bedroom door had been closed, locked, for hours. I knocked. No answer. Knocked again. Still nothing. So I opened it. Not violently, not dramatically, just opened it. Because she was my daughter. Because it was my house. Because silence from a teenager behind a locked door doesn't feel like independence. It feels like risk. She had been sitting on the floor. Headphones in, laptop open. Nothing dangerous, nothing alarming. Just closed off. She looked up at me. Same look, same controlled irritation. "You can't just come in," she said. I knocked. I didn't say come in. That was the beginning. Not the argument, the system. "This is my house," I said. Not angry, certain. "Your room is part of it." She stood up, slow, measured, then said something I didn't fully understand at the time. "I need space." "You have space." "No," she said, I need control." That word, control. I didn't hear it properly then. I heard defiance, disrespect, teenage language shaped by books and friends and whatever new idea she had picked up. So I answered the way I knew how. "You're 16. I'm still a person. You're my responsibility. I'm not your property." That's when it shifted. From moment to pattern. After that argument, I didn't apologize. I didn't ask questions. I adjusted rules, structured ones, clear ones, controlled ones, no locked doors, no closed communication, no unscheduled silence. Everything had to be known. Everything had to be accessible. Because that felt like safety. Because I told myself, if I can see it, I can protect it. What I didn't realize was what I was teaching. I looked at Phoebe, standing in front of me, in her own house, in her own system, and saw it clearly for the first time. This wasn't new. This wasn't internet parenting. This wasn't modern anxiety. This was structure. Inherited, refined, upgraded. "You didn't learn this online," I said. Phoebe frowned. "What?" "This." I gestured around the room. "The rules, the control, the structure. It's called preparation." "No," I said. "It's called memory." She didn't respond, because now we were somewhere else. Not in her nursery, not in her system, in something older. "You didn't like it when I did it to you," I said. That landed. Her eyes shifted. Not defensive, not yet. Recognizing. "I wasn't doing this," she said. "Yes, you were." "No." "Yes." We stood there. Same stance, same tension, different generation, same pattern. "You controlled everything," she said quietly. There it was. Not accusation. Fact. I thought I was protecting you. You were controlling me. I didn't know the difference. I did. That line. Cut clean. Because it wasn't emotional. It was remembered. "So now you're doing the same thing," I said. "No." "Yes." "This is different." "How?" Silence. Because difference requires justification, and justification requires honesty. "I'm not controlling her," Phoebe said. "I'm protecting her." I nodded slowly because that sentence was mine. 15 years ago, word for word. "You're not protecting her from the world," I said. "You're protecting yourself from uncertainty." She shook her head, but it wasn't strong, because now she could see it too. Not fully, but enough. That blanket isn't dangerous, I said. You are. That hit, because it reframed everything. Not the object, the system. We stood there. No more arguments, no more rules. Just recognition. Not agreement. Recognition. Now the story had changed. The blanket wasn't the conflict. The rules weren't new. The system was inherited. Only one question remained. Would it continue or stop here? The room went quiet in a way that didn't belong to design. Not curated, not controlled, just real. Phoebe didn't move. Neither did I. For the first time since I walked in, there were no rules being enforced, no system running, just two people, standing inside something they both recognized. I could have pushed. That would have been easy. Use the moment, press harder, turn recognition into surrender, force her to admit it, force her to change. That's what control looks like. I knew that, because I had done it before. Instead, I stepped back. Literally, one step. Not dramatic, not symbolic, just space. That was decision 11, and it changed everything. I'm not going to argue with you, I said. Phoebe looked up, surprised, because argument is the system. Remove it, and there's nothing to run. You're allowed to have rules, I continued. That mattered, because I wasn't rejecting her system. I was stepping out of it. But I'm not going to earn my way into your child's life. That landed harder, because it removed negotiation, removed compliance, removed the idea that access is something granted by performance. What does that mean? She asked. Real question, not defensive, uncertain. It means I won't trade obedience for presence. That was the core. Not about blankets, not about wool, about position. I'm her grandmother, I said. Not an applicant. Silence, because that wasn't something her system accounted for. In her world, everything had conditions. Everything had structure. Everything had rules. Except this. I'll respect your space, I said. I'll respect your choices. I won't bring things you don't want. I won't show up uninvited. Clear, reasonable, complete. Then, the line that mattered. But I won't shrink myself to fit your system. That was the boundary. Not aggressive, not emotional, final. If that means less time, I added, then that's your decision. Not mine. That shifted the weight. Back to her, where it belonged. Phoebe looked at the crib, then at the blanket, then back at me. And for the first time, she hesitated. Not because she was unsure about the rules, because she was unsure about the cost. Do you still have your old blanket? I asked. That question didn't belong in the moment, which is why it worked. She frowned. What? The one you slept with when you were little? Silence, then, yes. Where is it? Pause. In the closet. Is it certified? That hit. Not hard, not loud, but precise. Because now, the system had turned inward. She didn't answer. Didn't need to, because the answer didn't matter. The realization did. That the thing she had loved most as a child would not pass her own rules now. I'm not asking you to use this, I said, holding up the blanket. I'm asking you to see it. Not as risk, not as violation, as what it is. Phoebe stepped forward. Slow, careful, not toward me, toward the blanket. She didn't take it. Not yet. Just looked at it. Really looked. For the first time, not scanning, not evaluating, seeing, then she did something small, almost invisible. She reached out, touched the edge. Just once, not long, but enough. Not physically, but structurally. Because that touch was not compliance, not acceptance, not surrender. It was interruption of the system. We'll keep it, she said quietly. Not confident, not certain, but real. Not in the crib, she added. Of course. That was fine, because that wasn't the point anymore. I nodded. Not because I won, because the system shifted, even slightly is enough. I picked up my bag, walked to the door, no tension, no performance, just done. I didn't get the moment I imagined. I didn't get the place I expected. I didn't get the role I thought I had earned. But I got something else, something cleaner, something real. She handed my blanket back, so I handed her back the choice.